Many people have done a list of their favorite Godzilla films, putting them in whatever subjective order seemed good to them at the time. But when it came time for me to figure it out, I wanted to take a more scientific approach. What actually are my favorite Godzilla films from the Showa era? Not merely what I think are my favorites. And there is where All Our Ideas comes in. All Our Ideas is an open source wiki survey provider that allows users to create pairwise comparisons. You feed it a list of options, and then it asks users, in this case me, to choose my preference between a random pair of options. After a sizable number of results, it can generate a predictive chart, meaning that it can predict how often, between any given pair of options, you will choose one or the other. It will predict, for example, that between any two options, I will choose to watch Godzilla vs. Hedorah 67% of the time, or Frankenstein vs. Baragon 43% of the time. And it is from those results that I scientifically determined what my favorite Showa era Godzilla films are. That is, which Godzilla films I would most likely choose to watch given the option. And I say Godzilla a little loosely. These are all 28 of Toho's Showa era kaiju and kaiju adjacent films, some of which don't feature Godzilla at all. The only one missing is The Last War, because while it is adjacent as a tokusatsu film, it really is an apocalyptic character drama and not quite in the same class as the rest. So without further ado, and starting from the bottom, number 28, War of the Gargantuas, number 27, Son of Godzilla, number 26, All Monsters Attack, and number 25, Latitude Zero. Well, go figure. What are universally considered some of the worst Godzilla films are at the bottom of my list, and War of the Gargantuas. I know that apparently everyone else in my comment section loves it, but I don't, and would prefer to watch literally anything else. From here, we get into a bunch of those ones from the 70s that are trying to find a balance between the general angst and ennui of the decade and Godzilla as a children's hero. Number 24, Terror of Mechagodzilla. Number 23, Godzilla vs. Gigan. Number 22, Godzilla vs. Mechagodzilla. And number 21, Godzilla vs. Megalon. Now don't ask me to explain how Godzilla vs. Megalon ended up higher than the other three in this section, except that as pretentious as I might be, I'm not immune to a good bad monster movie, and Godzilla vs. Megalon is one of the best bad monster movies in the entire series. What I will say for all these films is that they do have some great monsters. Gigan, Mechagodzilla, and Megalon are all great designs. King Caesar is an interesting idea, transmutating the guardian lion concept into a kaiju, which has an interesting appeal of traditional Japanese culture. But I'm not sold on Jet Jaguar, though. The next batch are all from the 50s and 60s, with one 1970 outlier, exemplifying how the mid-century is my favorite period for these films. And honestly, ranking between 10 and 20 is pretty tight, because on any given day, in any given mood, I might end up preferring one of these over the other for whatever reason. But this is what my scientific study came up with. Number 20, Rodan. Rodan is alright, but besides the red herring at the beginning, it doesn't have a whole lot of weight to it. Number 19, Ebera, Horror of the Deep. A strange little movie that I think would have been a million times better if it actually did have King Kong in it, as was the original plan. As it is, we get a lesser entry in the Godzilla series, with a Godzilla that just acts a lot like Kong. Number 18, Gorath. This is only a kaiju film by virtue of the last-minute addition of a Titanic walrus. Otherwise, it's an interesting sci-fi film on humanity dealing with an apocalyptic threat. Number 17, Mothra vs. Godzilla. The kami of life, death, and rebirth faces off against an atomic abomination born of human technology and hate. Even if the plot is a little strange, the themes are fantastic. Number 16, Frankenstein vs. Baragon. Though the results are a little uneven, this film has a rather inventive premise that I can get behind. Nature, nurture, kindness, and mistrust are explored in this outcome of the mad science of the Axis forces. Number 15. Ghidorah, the three-headed monster. Honestly, this might be a bit sentimental, since Ghidorah, the three-headed monster, was the VHS tape that I had as a kid. Number 14. Space Amoeba. Probably one of the last of the island cycle of Toho's films, this one features some big bang for the buck as a cosmic amoeba comes to Earth and mutates tropical wildlife to kaiju size. Number 13. Varan. Varan is an also-ran in kaiju history. But if for no other reason, I enjoy it for being a classic black and white film. To quote Walter Benjamin, the gray film of dust covering things has become their best part. Number 12. Godzilla Raids Again. The first sequel to Godzilla is very tonally different, but what else were they going to do? An even darker and more dour film? Instead, we get a generally more lighthearted, though still tragic, film about life going on amidst the Cold War. Number 11. Mothra. Toho tries a new giant monster, and this time light onto the idea of kaiju as a kami, a goddess of life, death, and rebirth. Nature benevolent when treated with respect, but hostile to humankind when abused, irradiated, and exploited. And now we get to the top 10. None of these should be too surprising if you've been following my videos on the subject so far, and I don't imagine that I have too much more to add from what I've already said, but here we go. Number 10. Godzilla vs. Hedorah. Despite being from the 70s, I appreciate this film for its attempt to do something really new with Godzilla. Not only with the theme, leaning into environmental concerns, but even with how a Godzilla film looks. The animated segments and psychedelic music videos really set it visually apart from other films. Plus, Hedorah is one of the most terrifying kaiju. New standards allowed for more graphic depictions of death befitting toxic waste come to life. Number 9. King Kong vs. Godzilla. Shocking that both Kong movies would end up on my top 10. The lower place goes to King Kong vs. Godzilla, the original battle royal in more ways than one. While technically Godzilla Raids Again was the first monster fight, this was the first crossover monster fight, the first cinematic universe film after a 7-year hiatus, pitting the villainous Godzilla against the more popular and heroic King Kong. After this would come crossovers with Mothra and Rodan, and aside from its historical status, this film stands on its own as a biting satire on Japan's post-war economy and entertainment. Number 8. The Mysterians. The Mysterians have come for Earth women. In this great, solid science fiction film, we see the possible effects of atomic radiation on humankind, or at least human-like aliens, whose own genome has been so corrupted that they cannot reproduce anything but mutants. Their world has been rendered unlivable, and so they want a patch of Earth and a handful of nubile Earth women. But if we're not prepared to give it to them, then they're prepared to take the entire planet by force. Like some later films in the list, The Mysterians has some fantastic Japanese retro-futuristic designs. Number 7. Dogora. Here's one I've talked about many times now. To be fair, a lot of the weight here is carried by the monster design and the concept. A space jellyfish, a Lovecraftian, tentacled cosmic horror, has descended upon Earth in its insatiable quest for the element carbon. It begins with the most concentrated form in diamonds, eventually migrating onto coal. If not for the happenstantial discovery of one of its weaknesses, it might threaten all life on Earth, since carbon forms the building blocks of life as we know it. In the meantime, there's a bunch of jewel thieves and the cops trying to bust up their racket. One might criticize it as the nadir of Toho's A-plot, B-plot movie making, but that is part of what makes it so charmingly off the wall. Plus, the monster is a refreshing change from variations on dinosaurs. Number 6, Invasion of the Astro Monster. And number 5, Battle in Outer Space. Both Invasion of the Astro Monster and Battle in Outer Space figure as highly as they do because they are sprightly, mid-century atomic age sci-fi flicks. They've got great spaceships, space stations, and extraterrestrial invaders. I'm actually sorry that the Zillions didn't appear in more films. It seems like every other alien out there took a page from their book, using kaiju as an invasion force to break humankind. But it might have been nice to keep them as regular antagonists in the series, considering that they have the most startling appearance and evocative flying saucers. Battle in Outer Space is a straightforward sci-fi film that is perfected with the addition of kaiju in Invasion of the Astro Monster. Number 4, Atragon. This is one of the most fascinating of Toho's sci-fi movies, which is primarily what it is, in how it takes a novel from 1900 and recontextualizes it in the aftermath of World War II. The novel, Kaitai Gunkin by Shunro Oshikawa, is steeped in the culture and attitudes of militant Imperial Japan preceding the Sino-Japanese and Russo-Japanese wars. And the film Atragon becomes a means to reckon and reconcile with that past in Japan's modern, pacifist milieu. Instead of a means to Japanese expansionism and domination, the fantastic submarine battleship becomes the means by which Japanese ingenuity can save the entire world. A contribution by Japan to the global community, in some ways like Toho's films themselves. Number 3, Destroy All Monsters. And here we have the most epic Godzilla film. What was to be the big blowout final film in the franchise, pooling together as many monsters and spaceships from the franchise as existed by that time, including many that had never been seen together and never would be again. The Zillions have been replaced by the Kilaks, but the plot is essentially the same. Take over the minds of Earth's monsters and use them to conquer the planet. There's no intelligent plot to speak of here. This is a pure spectacle of property destruction, mid-century sci-fi, and monsters stomping the crap out of each other. Number 2, King Kong Escapes. Now try and make a perfect Showa kaiju movie without Godzilla, and you get King Kong Escapes. The Rankin Bass cartoon provides a very loose skeleton on which to hang a story that has everything a Toho monster mash should have. Giant monsters, robot doubles, sci-fi shenanigans, Cold War intrigue, mad scientists, and mind control. It's also got my boy King Kong, in a far superior suit to the previous version. But the star of the show really is Mechanicong, the original robot kaiju copycat. And finally, number 1, Godzilla. And in first place, the most unsurprising entry. Gojira is one of the best movies ever made, certainly one of the best Japanese films ever, and in a class of its own above most other science fiction and horror movies. It is a moody, melancholy meditation on the war, the atomic bombings, and subsequent atomic anxiety that is all the more profound by being from the only country to have ever had atomic bombs dropped on it. There really isn't much more I have to say, or could meaningfully add, to why the original Godzilla is such a superb film.